I've mentioned the serpent seed doctrine a couple of times now. I've also mentioned that I have several issues with the serpent seed doctrine as it's understood by the Christian identity movement. As I've stated, I see things a little differently and come from more of a Gnostic perspective. As I see it, Christian identity is essentially just a race-obsessed offshoot of fundamentalist Christianity. And I'm not a fan of fundamentalist Christianity. I've also brought up the idea that similar or even identical symbols can have different or even opposite meanings or interpretations. This is just as true of the serpent symbol. I think it's a mistake to assume that the serpent always means evil, or always indicates Satan, or the synagogue of Satan. I've stated that, in my view, the twin serpent motif is necessary. In the past, I've expressed the view of certain Gnostic sects that the serpent in the Garden of Eden story was actually the good guy, and that the Elohim were the bad guys. And I say bad guys because Elohim is plural. This is why they say, "Let us make man in our image." In my interpretation, this refers to the Archons, or the rulers of this world. Paul talks about them when he says that our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the Archons. That is to say, our war isn't with other human beings, but with these false gods. Since I've defended this Gnostic interpretation of Genesis in the past, and I've recently talked about the serpent seed doctrine, according to which, as it's usually understood, the serpent is identified with Satan, some people have been understandably confused. This is a part of my dialectical teaching method, though. First, a thesis is presented, then an antithesis, and then a higher synthesis. And in this way, we progress toward higher understanding. So let me see if I can synthesize the Gnostic interpretation of Genesis with something like the serpent seed doctrine. Remember, I've never said that I endorse the serpent seed doctrine as it's presented by the Christian identity movement. I've only said that I think there is something to this core theme. And that has to do with the Edomites versus the true Israelites. We can also think of this as being a conflict between the sons of Cain and the sons of Seth. Much of what I've said about the modern Israelites and the modern Edomites is based on history, genetics, linguistics, and so on. That much is true, whether or not you accept my interpretation of ancient myths and legends. The Anglo-Saxon people are the descendants of the ancient Israelites, and the ones Jesus called a den of vipers are the descendants of the ancient Edomites. That much, I believe, is well supported by evidence, and there's more than enough proof of this to convince anyone who has an open mind. It's also very easy to show that the Edomites are the enemies of the true Israelites and have conspired to commit genocide against them. These are facts, and not simply a matter of interpretation. But to be clear, I am getting into the realm of myths and legends now. This is a more subjective domain, and so I'm giving my interpretation of these myths, stories, and symbols. I will offer justifications for my interpretations, but they are still my interpretations, and I admit that freely. And so it's fine with me if you disagree with some of my interpretations, as long as you accept the facts. So without any more rhetorical throat clearing, let me jump right into the Genesis story. Since we're talking about the serpent seed, we should first see what it has to say about the serpent. Let me be clear, I do not read the book of Genesis literally. I think this is very plainly a mythical account and not a historical one. But I am going to base my interpretation on what the text literally says. And I'm using the King James Version. In Genesis 2, verse 16 through 17, it says, "And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, Of every tree of the garden thou mayest freely eat. But the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, thou shalt not eat of it. For in the day that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die." Now let's look at what the serpent says when he allegedly deceives Eve. In chapter 3, verse 4 and 5, it says, "And the serpent said unto the woman, Ye shall not surely die. For God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes will be opened, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil." We're always told that the serpent deceived Eve. But let's look at the actual biblical text. God says, or the character referred to as God in this text, says that if they eat the fruit, the day they do, they'll die. The serpent says that's a lie, and that the truth is they won't die, but instead their eyes will be opened, and they'll be as gods. So what actually happens? Who told the truth, and who lied? Verse 6 and 7 tell us, "And when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree to be desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit thereof, and did eat, and gave also unto her husband with her, and he did eat. And the eyes of them both were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together, and made themselves aprons." So they didn't die, at least not yet. The day isn't over yet, but apparently they don't end up dying that very day. They live a lot longer. Not only do they live long enough to have a few children, they live for a few centuries, according to the Bible. So the Elohim lied. The serpent told the truth. Their eyes were opened. This is confirmed again in verse 22, when the Elohim, or the chief of the Elohim, says, "Behold, the man is become as one of us, to know good and evil." Exactly what the serpent said. "And now, lest he put forth his hand, and take also of the tree of life, and eat, and live forever." He kicks him out of the garden. So apparently it's not eating of the tree of knowledge that causes death, it's being deprived of the tree of life that eventually causes death. That's the picture you get from literally reading the text. And also notice the plural form again. Man has become as one of us. Who is us? And in what sense has man become like them? It seems to have to do with knowledge, doesn't it? It's the fact that their eyes are opened. They've become illuminated. And that gnosis, or illumination, seems to have to do with the nature of good and evil. The so-called Christian identity folks teach us that this story somehow refers to Eve having sex with the serpent, and that the knowledge refers to a sexual union, some type of miscegenation, such as when the Bible says, "And Adam knew his wife." In my view, the text doesn't justify this interpretation. And Adam ate the fruit too, so I guess they think they had a threesome? But how would this result in their eyes being opened? How would this result in them becoming like gods? That wouldn't make any sense, would it? Yet the whole serpent seed doctrine, as presented by the Christian identity movement, is based on the idea that the serpent was the devil, and that Cain was the son of the devil. The first claim is false. The second claim might arguably be true, but not in the way they think. Let's look at what the text actually says. Genesis 4, verse 1 says, "And Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived, and bare Cain. And she said, I have gotten a man from the Lord. It doesn't say that the serpent knew Eve. It says Adam knew his wife, and she gave birth to Cain. But, strangely enough, she says, I have gotten a man from the Lord. She doesn't say, I've gotten a man from my husband Adam. So there's no evidence in the text that Cain was the son of the serpent. On the surface, it seems that he was the son of Adam. But the text could also be interpreted as hinting, at least, that Cain was the son of the Lord, or in other words, the son of the Elohim. In other versions of the text, the Elohim, or Archons, either rape or attempt to rape Eve. And of course, later in Genesis, we hear about the sons of God knowing the daughters of men and creating a hybrid race. So this interpretation would be consistent with that biblical tradition. And if we associate the Elohim with the Archons, or the false gods of this world, then this would make Cain the son of Satan, but not the son of the serpent. Keep in mind, the serpent did not lie. The chief of the Elohim did. So when Jesus tells the Pharisees that they are children of their father the devil, who is a liar, who is he talking about? Is he talking about the serpent who told the truth? Or the chief of the Elohim who lied? Let's also consider who Paul was talking about in 2 Corinthians 4:4, when he said, in whom the God of this world hath blinded the minds of them which believe not, lest the light of the glorious gospel of Christ, who is the image of God, should shine unto them. If we draw a comparison, the God of this world would be the chief of the Elohim in the Old Testament, who blinds the minds of men. Lest the light of the glorious gospel, the fruit of knowledge, who is the image of God, should shine unto them. Well, how do you see light shining unless your eyes are opened? And then again we see this image of God motif, being transformed into the image of the Father. That might seem a little bit of a stretch, but at the very least, Paul is identifying the God of this world with some type of malevolent being who has blinded the minds of men, or the minds of them which believe not. So did the serpent blind the minds of men? No. It was through the serpent that their eyes were opened. It was their obedience to the chief of the Elohim that they remained blind. And so it's my contention that the God of Genesis is the chief Archon, or the chief of the Elohim, the demiurge of the Gnostics. He is Satan, or the false god of this world. And they, the Archons, or the Elohim, are the den of vipers. And those who are sons of their father the devil do the work of their father, as Jesus says to the Pharisees, the Edomites. In Luke 11:52, Jesus makes this accusation against them. For ye have taken away the key of knowledge. Ye entered not in yourselves, and them that were entering in ye hindered. Doesn't that sound a lot like the Elohim keeping Adam and Eve from eating the tree of knowledge, and then once they do, kicking them out of the garden and putting the flaming sword there so they can't partake of the tree of life? They can't enter in, but they're hindered. Isn't that interesting? In Genesis, the Elohim want to keep the fruit of knowledge away from man. And in Luke, the den of vipers are keeping the key of knowledge away from men. And so in this sense, they both do the work of their father, the devil. So is Jesus more like the Elohim or more like the serpent? In John 3:14, Jesus says, "And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up." Isn't it interesting that Jesus himself uses this serpent analogy? The verse is obviously referring to Numbers 21:8, which says, "And the Lord said unto Moses, Make thee a fiery serpent, and set it upon a pole, and it shall come to pass that every one that is bitten, when he looketh upon it, shall live." Notice that in this Old Testament story, the Israelites are on their way to destroy the Edomite cities, and they're attacked by these venomous snakes in the wilderness. I see these venomous snakes as being related to the Edomites, or the den of vipers in the New Testament, which I've argued are also Edomites. The venom of these vipers is poisonous and brings death. But the brass serpent which is lifted up the pole gives life to those who open their eyes and look upon it. And so there are the venomous serpents which bring death, and there is the serpent which offers life. And Jesus himself compares himself to this serpent. Let's look at John 3:14 through 15 again. "And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life." So do you see the parallel? In the Old Testament story of Moses, the children of Israel had been bitten by the vipers. They had been poisoned by their venom. Symbolically, perhaps, they had been deceived or blinded by their lies and deceitful propaganda, and this was killing them. In the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve were blinded by the gods of this world, who blind the minds of men by keeping them from eating the tree of knowledge. In the gospel story, they were deceived by the false Talmudic religion of the Pharisees, the den of vipers, who kept the keys of knowledge hidden and taught their false Edomite religion, Talmudic Babylonian Judaism. There's a lot more that could be said on this, but just consider the Garden of Eden story in relation to the story of Moses and Jesus. Personally, I see several parallels. But let's move on to the story of Cain and Abel. First of all, it's interesting to note that the name Cain means spear or spear bearer. And when I was looking into the etymology of the name Cain, I found that the Romans were known by a form of this word and were called spear bearers. So it's interesting that a Roman soldier or spear bearer thrust his spear into Jesus' side on the cross. And according to tradition, the Romans are believed to have been Edomites as well. I think the authors of the Gospels would have been aware of these linguistic and symbolic associations. In Genesis, it doesn't actually tell us how Cain killed Abel. Since his name means spear, we might expect this to be the murder weapon. But even though the Bible doesn't tell us, the way the story is usually told, Cain killed his brother by crushing his head with a rock. Let's look at what the text actually says. Genesis 4 verse 8 simply says, "And Cain talked with Abel his brother. And it came to pass," it just came to pass, "when they were in the field, that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and slew him." So it doesn't say how he killed him. It's only tradition that tells us that he hit him over the head with a rock. But I think there's a reason for that tradition. Let's look at the serpent's curse in Genesis 3, verse 14 and 15. "And the Lord God said unto the serpent, Because thou hast done this, thou art cursed above all cattle, and above every beast of the field. Upon thy belly shalt thou go, and dust shalt thou eat for all the days of thy life. And I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. As a side note, it's interesting that in Galatians 3:13, it says, Christ hath redeemed us from the curse of the law, being made a curse for us. So it seems that Christ, like the serpent, was cursed for the sake of those he came to liberate from the power of the gods of this world. But that's a side note. I want to focus on the serpent's curse. It's interesting that the curse involves enmity between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman, not the seed of the man. And notice that in the gospel story, the writers make sure we understand that Jesus was born of a woman with no earthly father. He is the woman's seed, then. And the main antagonist of the story are the children of the devil, as he calls them. He also calls them a den of vipers. But as we've also seen, he compares himself to the serpent raised up in the wilderness, who I've argued is also analogous to the serpent on the tree in the Garden of Eden. And I think the confusion here is the result of deliberate obfuscation. Keep in mind that the texts that make up the Old Testament that's been passed down to us today were compiled and edited during the Babylonian captivity, during the same period when Talmudic Judaism emerged. Although many scholars insist that the texts themselves are older, the version of the text that exists today are essentially the product of Babylonian, Talmudic, Edomite scribes. It's impossible to know to what extent they corrupted the original text. I believe there were probably several key passages that were tampered with. There may have been some significant omissions and additions made in order to promote a different narrative. So although the ancient text, which we no longer have, were part of the tradition of Moses and part of the tradition of the ancient Hebrews, the version of these texts that we have now are probably more of a reflection of the tradition of the elders, or the tradition of the Babylonian, Talmudic, Edomite Pharisees. As such, some key passages may be deliberately obscured or completely inverted. This is consistent with Jesus' claim that the teachers of the law have hidden the keys of knowledge. And if my analysis is correct, we should especially expect to find deliberate omissions, obfuscations, and inversions in passages related to these two seed lines. I believe this is why some Gnostics used inversion in their exegesis of certain Old Testament stories, such as the story of the Garden of Eden, and in some cases, the story of Cain and Abel. So like I've said, I think there's very strong evidence that the Anglo-Saxons are the true sons of Israel, or the sons of Isaac, Isaac's sons, Saxons, and that their enemies, who have stolen their identity, are the Edomites. Interpreting some of these Old Testament stories is more tricky, though. For example, sometimes in the Old Testament, it's hard to know whether the God being referred to is the true God of Israel or the false gods of Edom. Of course, there are many different Hebrew words in the Old Testament which are all translated simply as God. So that doesn't help either. And even if you could read the Hebrew, like I said, these words may have been altered by the Babylonian Edomite scribes. It's just hard to separate the wheat from the tares, so to speak. All we can do is analyze the texts that we have and try to make sense of them. So the text tells us that there would be enmity between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent, and that the former would bruise the head of the latter, and that the latter would bruise the heel of the former. Remember that when Eve had Cain, she said, "I have gotten a man from the Lord." She didn't say she has gotten a man from Adam or the serpent, but from the Lord. Then again, the passage also previously states that Adam knew his wife. So maybe Cain is Adam's son. Or maybe the demiurge or the archons raped Eve. You could argue either way till you're blue in the face, but in either case, Cain is the woman's seed, not the serpent's seed. And according to tradition, Cain killed his brother by hitting him over the head with a rock. This seems to fit the prophecy of the curse. But that would imply that Abel, and not Cain, was the serpent's seed. So the Christian identity folks got it completely backwards. And the same goes for the story of Esau and Jacob. The text tells us that 2 nations are within thy womb, speaking of Rebekah, who is pregnant with twins. Obviously, Esau is the nation of Edom, and Jacob is the nation of Israel. But which is the serpent seed? Our clue is that in Genesis 25, verse 24 through 26, it tells us, "And when her days to be delivered were fulfilled, behold, there were twins in her womb. And the first came out red all over like a hairy garment, and they called his name Esau. And after that came his brother out, and his hand took hold on Esau's heel, and his name was called Jacob." This seems to identify Jacob, and not Esau, as the seed of the serpent, according to the prophecy of the serpent's curse in Genesis. And interestingly, both the serpent and Jacob are called deceivers, and considered cunning, crafty, or wise. But again, Christian identity gets it backwards and says that Esau is the serpent seed. But again, I mean serpent here, in the sense of the serpent in the garden who revealed Gnosis in the garden, or the brass serpent who was lifted up in the wilderness by Moses, which Christ compared himself to. I don't mean the den of vipers associated with the Edomites or the Elohim. What I think is that these people have tried to steal the identity of the true serpent seed because of jealousy and envy. And this is confirmed in the passages I read in my talk about the prophecies concerning the destruction of Edom. So we might call them the serpent seed in a pejorative sense, but they're not the true serpent seed. And I think that calling them vipers is a form of ironic mockery or sarcasm. When the Pharisees claim to be the children of Abraham, Jesus rebukes them and says they're not the children of Abraham, but children of their father the devil, the demiurge. They're claiming to be the true serpent seed, which is the seed of Seth, who basically replaced Abel after he was murdered, and the seed of Jacob, who is of the seed of Seth. So Jesus is basically saying, you say you're the chosen serpent seed? Yeah, you're serpents all right, a den of vipers. In other words, they're venomous, poisonous snakes who bring death. And remember that Paul says that the law, that is to say, the law of the Pharisees, brings sin and death, but that life and salvation come through Christ, who is like the serpent raised up in the wilderness. This interpretation explains why the Gnostics, known as the Sethians, associated themselves with the symbol of the serpent. For them, it wasn't a symbol for the devil. Quite the opposite. It's a symbol for the Messiah. And it's interesting to note here that the Hebrew word for serpent and Messiah both have a numerical value in gematria of 358. Whether you accept that as another proof or just a coincidence is up to you. But I'm still only scratching the surface. There's a lot more to cover. But let me close by suggesting that just like the Edomites corrupted the ancient religion of the Israelites, which I consider to essentially have been the religion of Akhenaten. They also corrupted the religion of Jesus, Paul, and the Gnostics, when the Church of Rome, in other words, the Church of Edom, claimed the title of the true Christian church and violently suppressed real Christianity, in other words, the religion of the so-called Gnostic heretics. And so this attempt on the part of the Edomites to impersonate the true Israelites, or the true serpent seed, seems to be a theme that's played out for a long time. I can't help but wonder whether the story of Jacob stealing Esau's birthright is a kind of Edomite propaganda, or an example of the tactic of accuse them of doing what you yourself are doing. Interestingly enough, that tactic is advocated in Rules for Radicals by Olinsky, who just so happens to be an Edomite. Is Rules for Radicals actually a very ancient Edomite playbook? There's a lot more I could say on several of the points I've raised, but I think I'm going to end here for now. Thanks for listening. Please hit the like button and share this video, because that helps a lot. YouTube does not promote my videos in search results. Also, if you'd like to support me through PayPal or Patreon, my links are below. And be sure to follow me on BitChute in case this channel gets deleted. Peace.